The Wilderness Act of 1964, written by Howard Zahniser and signed by President Johnson, opened a large pathway for the environmental movements and helped preserve nature and wilderness up until today. By signing that first act, it was signing into a lifetime of wilderness preservation that continues to grow. Wilderness preservation is important for humanity, plants, animals, and the environment. Wilderness is an area where the earth and community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. On September 3, 1964, the Wilderness Act was signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson, which put approximately 9.1 million acres under the federal government and created the National Wilderness Preservation System. However, the bill had a long story of being rewrote about 66 times in the span of about 8 years. The long path to the Wilderness Act. The environmentalist movement started when the National Park Service was established in 1916, but grew even larger with Roosevelt's New Deal that brought up the environment and conservation. FDR was big on conservation, and when he was both governor and president, he played a large role in the environment and conservation movement. When he became president, he signed the Emergency Conservation Work Act, which created the CCC that caused civilians to work in the conservation movement. The national land not only included parks and monuments, but also cemeteries, memorials, and military parks. The New Deal built a strong base for the conservation movement to continue to get larger. Fighting against the wilderness by making it easier to transport people and resources, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 on June 29. A month later, the Koss Construction Company of Des Moines, Iowa, was given $1 million contract from the Missouri State Highway Commission to build concrete in US 66. In the same program, I-45 was being built, and the project would become part of the Great Highway. From there, the interstate system only grew, which caused more automobiles to be used. This caused more emissions in the air, like CO2 and other greenhouse gases. The pollution, like oil and tire runoff, only increased after the highway systems started to get built. The controversy over the dam at Echo Park led to the Wilderness Act. The environmentalist movement was growing bigger in 1950, and many people were against the dam because they believed it was against the National Park Service Act of 1916. The Bureau of Reclamation wanted the dam built for hydroelectricity to help economic growth that was happening at the time after World War II. The protesters and campaigners finally won, and Congress made sure that a dam was not going to be built in Echo Park. Individuals could also have a big impact on working toward taking better care of the environment. A little bit later, in 1962, the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson was published, which brought more attention to the environment and the impact on it, like pesticides. Silent Spring was an important factor in the Wilderness Act. Silent Spring was published, which shed light on the use of pesticides and the negative impact it had on wilderness and wildlife. Rachel Carson, the author, identified a pesticide, DDT, which could kill several types of insects. In the book, she wrote about how governments needed to put in more effort into protecting the environment and encouraged everyone to be protective of the environment. President John F. Kennedy read the book and ordered scientists to look over what she had stated in the book about pesticides. Afterwards, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, America's population was growing and expanding. Mechanization also started, and this caused a large loss of wilderness. After World War II, America was industrialized, and they needed more room to continue expanding, drilling for oil, and mining for coal. In light of these developments, environmentalists thought that wilderness lands needed federal protection. When the bill finally did get into Congress, President Lyndon B. Johnson, Senator Hubert Humphrey, and Representative John Saylor supported the Wilderness Bill and helped it to pass. Howard Zahniser, the original writer of the Wilderness Act, rewrote it about 66 times before it was finally passed on Congress on September 3, 1964. The law put approximately 9.1 million acres under the federal government. It also created the very impactful National Wilderness Preservation System. Environmentalists, however, were disappointed with the sacrifices they had to make in order to get the act passed through Congress. There were many people against the new legislation, like Senator Joseph O. Mahoney of Wyoming, Gordon Allott of Colorado, and Representative Wayne N. Aspinall, who opposed the bill and tried to slow it down from passing. The passage of the Wilderness Act empowered the Secretary of Agriculture to decide what kind of aircrafts and boats would be allowed into parks. The law also created regulations for livestock grazing and guidelines for the construction of transmission lines, water reservoirs, and water projects on federal land. Right after the bill was signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson, the act was viewed as a success and a savior for the American wilderness and wildlife. The Wilderness Act established the National Wilderness Preservation System, which protected the lands and put them under the authority of the federal government. It created Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in Minnesota, Bridger Wilderness in Wyoming, Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana, and Ansel Adams Wilderness in California. Today, the Wilderness Act of 1964 is more important than ever. It remains politically controversial because of the need to preserve and secure resources for a growing population. The wilderness that is protected by the Act is controversial because there is no mining, motorized vehicles, or commercial companies allowed on the land. Drilling is also not allowed, and as America's population grows, so does the need for important resources like oil. The debate between large companies and environmental groups like Sierra Club continues about whether it is more valuable as wilderness or if it was processed for its resources. However, especially now, because of all the demand for resources and land being destroyed to build new homes and expand, the Wilderness Act is essential to humanity. It creates a safe haven for animals that are threatened or endangered. It gives Americans wilderness that would not exist today if it wasn't for the Act. The Wilderness Act definitely had an important impact on the nature and wilderness we have today. The Act was the first major piece of legislation to get the ball rolling for other wilderness movements like Boundary Water Canoe Area Wilderness in Minnesota, Bridger Wilderness in Wyoming, Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana, and Ansel Adams Wilderness in California. Today, it has more than 750 areas of wilderness that are enjoyed by Americans and over 111 million acres of wilderness. There are only 6 states that do not have wilderness area in their borders. All of the lands under the Wilderness Act have been preserved and protected. The Wilderness Act of 1964 was also impactful economically. In 2013, wilderness jobs gave about $646 billion to the U.S. economy and provided more than 6 million jobs. Since the act was signed, there is a direct correlation between towns' taxes, county payroll, and average household income, and the amount of protected land near it.